Good evening, everybody. I am Dr. Patricia Akimi, the director of the Folger Institute, and I am honored to introduce Dr. Farah Karim-Cooper, who will deliver this year's Shakespeare's Birthday Lecture. Dr. Karim-Cooper became the director of the Folger Shakespeare Library in the fall of 2024, coming to us from Shakespeare's Globe in London, where she led for 2 decades as the head of research and then the director of education and research. As a leader, Dr. Karim-Cooper brings to the Folger a deep appreciation for all that this unique cultural institution has done over the past 90+ years in Shakespeare's adopted home, and an expansive vision for what we can accomplish as we approach the Folger's 2nd century. As a Shakespearean, an educator, and a prominent public scholar, Dr. Karim-Cooper has been a longtime friend of the Folger and a frequent collaborator in our projects, programs, and publications. As a friend and a mentor, she has been and continues to be at the center of a network of humanist thinkers and of humans who rely upon her and her model of what it means to be a public-facing Shakespearean. And she's also really fun to hang out with. I'd like to share with you a little about Dr. Karim-Cooper's career and impressive credentials. But let me do so with the preamble that there are very few people in the world with such breadth of experience and demonstrable impact as a public intellectual. Dr. Karim-Cooper was appointed Professor of Shakespeare Studies at King's College London from 2020 to 2024. She held an Oxford Humanities Cultural Program Fellowship and was a visiting fellow of Exeter College, Oxford. She served as the president of the Shakespeare Association of America from 2021 to 2022, after serving 5 years on its board of trustees. She also serves on the board of trustees for the Royal Academy of Dramatic Arts, the Lyric Hammersmith Theatre, and the Warburg Institute. In the UK, she founded the first ever Early Modern Scholars of Color Network. She received the British Shakespeare Association Fellowship Award in 2023 for her contribution to Shakespeare studies and inclusivity. Dr. Karim-Cooper was interviewed by the BBC mere days after arriving at Shakespeare's Globe, and quickly became a regularly featured and recognizable public face of Shakespearean expertise. She served as the Globe director of the Shakespeare Centre London, a major research partnership between the Globe and King's College. She was a project leader in the construction of the Sam Wanamaker Playhouse, the indoor Jacobean theater at Shakespeare's Globe, and she founded and curated the Globe's Shakespeare and Race Festival. Dr. Karim-Cooper served as a Shakespeare consultant on dozens of major theatrical productions for the Globe, for the Royal Shakespeare Company, for the Old Vic and other London theaters, and has been awarded the B. Iden Payne Award for Outstanding Dramaturgy. And during all this, in her copious free time, she has also published widely on Shakespeare, on his theaters, and the culture of early modern England. She is a leader in the examination of Shakespeare's plays through the lens of race and social justice. In addition to publishing over 40 journal articles and chapters in scholarly collections, she is the author of The Great White Bard, How to Love Shakespeare While Talking About Race, of Cosmetics in Shakespearean and Renaissance Drama, and of The Hand on the Shakespearean Stage, Gesture, Touch, and Spectacle of Dismemberment. She is the co-editor of Shakespeare's Globe, a theatrical experiment with Christy Carson, of Shakespeare's Theaters and Effects of Performance with Tiffany Stern, and of Moving Shakespeare Indoors, Performance and Repertoire in the Jacobean Playhouse with Andrew Gurr. She's the editor of an essay collection, Titus Andronicus, The State of Play, and of the text of John Webster's The Duchess of Malfi for the Rutledge Anthology of Early Modern Drama. And finally, she is the general editor for Arden's Shakespeare in the Theater series and their Critical Intersections series. Her public-facing work includes numerous media appearances for news programs, for podcasts and documentaries, like 2023's Making Shakespeare, the first folio for PBS, and Shakespeare, The Rise of a Genius for BBC Two, and of course, her most recent book, The Great White Bard, How to Love Shakespeare While Talking About Race. Looking back to the early modern period, the 18th and 19th centuries, while being highly relevant for today, this book is a historically grounded and incisive treatment of race, both in the text and performance of Shakespeare's plays, and it examines the processes that enshrined Shakespeare as the definitive genius and pinnacle of Western literature and culture. And it offers readers a chance to know and to love the plays anew in the light of these truths. The Great White Bard was recognized as a top book by Time Magazine, by NPR, and by The New Yorker. This evening, Dr. Karim-Cooper presents Shakespeare Beyond Relevance with a special guest, Alyssa Keegan, who will play Orsino in this spring's Folger Theater production of Twelfth Night. And following the talk, there will be time to answer a few questions before we enjoy a post-lecture reception. Please, join me in welcoming Dr. Farah Karim-Cooper.
Patricia, thank you so much for that amazing introduction. It makes me feel tired, actually. It is such an honor to stand up here and give this lecture. I can't tell you how many, I'm watching these lectures on YouTube over the years. It's such an honor to stand here and be the director of the Folger Shakespeare Library. Past directors like Gail Pastor, who's sitting here in the audience today, are people that I was in awe of through my career. And so to stand here is just an incredible privilege. I want to say a huge thank you first to Patricia and the Institute team for organizing, first of all, for inviting me to do this lecture and then organizing it. I want to say a huge thank you to the theater and performance and programming team for helping us with all the sort of technology that you see around us, for the little soapbox I'm standing on because I'm a little too short for the lectern. And also thank you to our development team for organizing the reception, and to our visitor experience team, who are just miraculous all the time. So this lecture is an unusual lecture for me in that I'm giving it, it's not sort of an academic lecture per se, but I do think that there's some academic kernels in there. So that's what's kind of unusual for me. And it's more in some ways, you will judge for yourself whether or not it's a manifesto. I'm not quite sure yet. In recent years, there's been a rising interest in the public humanities, or public scholarship. The idea of sharing scholarship with a general audience or creating a public humanities project is nothing new, of course. But in the past few years, there seems to have been a tangible urgency prompting scholars of the humanities in particular to make their research appeal more broadly. For Shakespeare studies, this involves making Shakespeare relevant. Even if this is something that each generation feels that it has done for about 400 years. For teachers, it might mean finding new strategies to relate Shakespeare to the current moment and to the lives and experiences of their students. What Patricia didn't mention is that I was a trainee teacher and a school teacher for a little while I was doing my PhD. And prior to that, and I remember when I was a teacher trainee in Southern California in the mid-90s, asking my students who were studying Romeo and Juliet to create answering machine messages for the characters. What would they say? I guarantee this is no longer an exercise in relevance. But at the time, it made the point. For theater artists, making a production that audiences can relate to is always the intention. Using contemporary references, settings, and progressive casting can charge a production with what we term contemporary relevance. But what does it really mean for us to be, for us in 2025, for Shakespeare to be relevant? What do we mean by this term anyway? Is it about keeping Shakespeare and by extension the arts and the humanities in the cultural and public conversation? And if so, what is its function there? So taking the idea of relevance as a starting point, I want to explore tonight how we might reposition Shakespeare now as we move into a challenging phase of American democracy. Since taking up my position as director of the Folger, I've been asked the question, or some variation thereof, what is the point of studying Shakespeare? What is the purpose? Is he still relevant? And being completely candid, when I look out my office window and see the Capitol's dome, I wonder if I can answer this question right now, because things are changing rather rapidly. Looking back over my career, however, this question has often been put to me because of my association with Shakespeare organizations, where I'm often seen as a custodian of the bard. Shakespeare's relevance, however, has been a contested issue for a long time. His work has been held up by theaters, educators, and even political regimes as testimony to his enduring commentary on social structures, politics, and power. He's been said to gesture beyond his moment, and even beyond our own moment, to a time in the future. But this idealizes the playwright in too many instances, and I'm not here to do that. I didn't take up this role at the Folger to encourage bardolatry. But I have spent most of my career working for organizations with Shakespeare in the name, so I better have an answer to this question. Asking this question in 2025 is a very different thing than asking it in 1994 or 2017 or even 2024. And while it seems like an urgent inquiry, for me, it doesn't quite hit the mark. The mission of the Folger is to preserve and provide access to the largest Shakespeare collection in the world. It is also to advance the understanding, appreciation, and indeed relevance of Shakespeare. Prior to my arrival, the Folger had long been engaged in questions of how Shakespeare speaks to the moment. This endeavor encapsulates the shifting perspectives on the role that the humanities can play within a healthy democracy. It demonstrates the Folger's founding principle that this capacious storehouse of Shakespearean texts has something to say to the American people. But the task ahead is to determine what it needs to say today. The term relevance emerged in the 1550s. It derives from the French for depending upon, and from the medieval Latin relevantem and relevare, to lighten or help assist, comfort, and console. The word relieve, in fact, is closely related to the origins of relevance. If we ask, is Shakespeare relevant, are we asking if his work is comforting, that it provides us with some form of consolation or relief? Perhaps. The arts and humanities in general are seen and have been seen and valued as islands of comfort, relief, retreat, a space for the soul to find restitution from labor and anguish. That's all really nice. The notion of relevance incurred several shifts over time, not just in common parlance, but also in intellectual thought. The critic Eliza Tamarkin writes that the concept of relevance is primarily an Anglo-American notion deriving from a word meaning to raise or to lift up again, and also to give relief, as we've identified. In the 19th century, literary figures and pragmatists such as Ralph Waldo Emerson and Alain Locke were preoccupied with relevance as something that was once disregarded, unvalued, or lost to us, having now renewed significance. But Shakespeare has never been unvalued, and he certainly isn't lost to us. Tamarkin also asks us to consider relevance as a concept calling for shifts in both attention and perceptions of importance with enormous social stakes. It remains an invitation, says one critic of Tamarkin's study, for the humanities and for all of us who feel tasked every day with finding the point in what we do. In everyday speech, the meaning feels limited. It's limited in scope, as most of us take it to mean pertinence, applicability, a recognizable connection between things, particularly between the past and the present. This definition took hold in around the 18th century. Nina Simon, an author in museum studies, recently wrote a guide for museum curators to help them unlock meanings that will make their work, as she puts it, more vital to the community. To find true relevance, she says, is the key. The role of museums, as far as I'm aware, is to enable artifacts and collections to speak to a nation by meeting it where it is. Relevance becomes seemingly crucial to such an endeavor. At the Folger are exhibits, particularly Power Players Tudor Edition, which if you haven't seen, please walk through. They certainly have that aim in mind. But I would argue that how we move from the somewhat static concept of this object is relevant to you to an active dynamic between object and visitor is the next step for us. Perhaps then the question, is Shakespeare still relevant, may itself be misleading and just might be the wrong question to ask. Relevance is observational. It encapsulates the reflection. I can see that situation A that took place in 1563 is similar to situation B that is taking place in 2025. It's an observation. Now, relevance theorists will of course see the relational dynamics between past and present, signs and objects as far more complex, but I'm just going to ask you to bear with my simplification. In the Shakespearean knowledge ecology, which includes not just institutions like the Folger, but also university departments, theater organizations, journalism, publishing, and social media, Shakespearean relevance has at times been debated, where arguments for keeping Shakespeare around are rooted in the premise that what he has to say speaks to or comments on all of us here and now. What strikes me as odd about this recurring question is that there has never been a real tangible threat to keeping Shakespeare around until now. In an op-ed piece for the New York Times, Drew Lichtenberg, who I think is here this evening, yes, there he is. Thank you for writing this piece. He provided evidence of Shakespeare's shrinkage. In 2018 to 19, there were more productions of Shakespeare across the United States than in 2022 to 2023, for example. But some people found it upsetting and weighed in on Shakespeare's relevance. In a letter to the editor of the New York Times in response to the op-ed, the author cited Judi Dench's claim on a British late-night talk show.
We quote Shakespeare all the time, perhaps without knowing it. You only have to go to those plays and be in any kind of those situations, being in love, or being jealous, or being angry, or being whatever, and you will find that there is a way of him summing up that is completely sufficient for what your emotion is.
What Dame Judi refers to is not his relevance, but Shakespeare's supposed universality and his capacity to capture our emotions through his phrasing. That's not the same. It also places Shakespeare in the category of nice to have, which frankly isn't enough to keep Shakespeare going for another 400 years, let alone the next 4. In his op-ed, Drew Lichtenberg argues vehemently that Shakespeare's work deals, I'll just put it up there so you can see it. Shakespeare's work, seeing your name in lights, nice, no. Deals with issues that remain just as relevant and contested today as they were in his time. His comedies suggest the fluidity of gender and the ambiguities of desire. His tragedies show us human beings coming face to face with our own failings. His history plays show us characters pursuing power at the expense of others. The Merchant of Venice and Othello show us how prejudice and hate divide us. In great philosophical and political plays like The Tempest, all these themes come together. This is all true. One problem that we have with focusing on relevance is that the next question is too easily, so what? What do we do with it? The urgency of the plays and their useful dramaturgical frameworks don't come readily to the surface. When I wrote about Shakespeare and race for a general readership in The Great White Bard, I was accused by some critics in Britain of trying to apply modern concepts to Shakespeare. This was by the same people who have argued for Shakespeare's relevance. Here's the conundrum. How can one hate modern applications to Shakespeare, which race is not a modern application, by the way, and champion relevance at the same time? It is because too often, again, for them, relevance is the same thing as universal. It's not about timeliness or urgency. Universality implies a particular lens on Shakespeare that represents a dominant culture. It is an elite lens, one that was established in the 18th century. At that time, there was a collective strategy to transform Shakespeare from a jobbing playwright in a scrappy new industry full of enterprise, commerce, and collaboration, attached through his theater company to nobles as well as monarchs, into a lone author, a native genius of England, mythologized into a poster child for empire with his puffy shirt and his quill, sitting alone, contemplative in his bedchamber or study in Stratford-upon-Avon. Through his apotheosis, he became unreachable, a god, and therefore untouchable to the masses. But the 16th century Shakespeare worked in the Globe Theatre. He worked with a group of bolshy but highly skilled actors for a very pernickety multitude. His plays were tuned to the frequency of the collective and to modernity, to the shifting cultural and political moment. Nobles, working people, and everyone in between went to the theater, stood cheek by jowl to be entertained, but also to be galvanized, to learn, unbeknown to them sometimes, how to think through dramaturgy. By developing cognitive muscles Shakespeare and his contemporaries understood needed to be flexed to navigate the monumental changes the early modern world was undergoing. Rise of commerce, proliferation of information, migration, trade, and colonial exploration, an increase in misinformation, anxieties about tyranny as the Jacobean king took to the throne and took over the nation's most significant theater company and playhouse. When Shakespeare's company became the King's Men, Shakespeare had his work cut out for him. What I want to do in the next part of the lecture is to provide a few examples from Shakespeare's plays to show how the theatricality of the plays and the language can be activated as spurs for our own critical inquiry. Urgency as a spur to action in Antony and Cleopatra, the use of classical texts as agents for discovery in Titus Andronicus, dramaturgy or theatricality simultaneously signifying fiction and reality in Henry V, and the uses of misinformation and conspiratorial thinking in Macbeth all point to Shakespeare's own awareness of the need for the application of curiosity and criticality amongst the governed. Early modern plays and their frameworks contribute to the creation of habits of mind that can be harnessed as tools to help ourselves navigate a way towards, dare I say, a healthy democracy. It's not odd that Shakespeare never used the word relevance. Instead, we get words like now, timely, untimely, time, or urgent. His moment witnessed profound changes from regime change, plague, religious wars, working class uprisings, all required agility and adaptiveness to change. Antony and Cleopatra is set against the backdrop of the transition from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire. Antony recognizes that his actions and inactions are raising the political stakes. Fulvia, his wife, his first wife, has died. Then he finds out other political moves are being made that have high consequences.
The death of Fulvia, with more urgent touches, do strongly speak to us. But the letters, too, of many contriving friends in Rome petition us at home. Sextus Pompeius hath given the dare to Caesar, and commands the empire of the sea. Our slippery people, whose love is never linked to the deserver till his deserts are past, begin to throw Pompey the Great and all his dignities upon his son, who high in name and power, higher than both in blood and life, stands up for the main soldier, whose quality going on, the sides of the world may danger. Much is breeding, while like the courser's hair hath yet but life, and not a serpent's poison. Say our pleasure to such whose place is under us requires our quick remove from hence.
Returning to Rome to move from passive luxury to active engagement, Antony is compelled by a sense of urgency, urgent touches. Urgency is a precursor to action. Unlike the concept of observation, which can produce only thought or contemplation. In his Roman plays, Shakespeare isn't contending that the classical past is relevant. The past is evoked not just to inspire contemplation in his audiences. Scholars have noted for decades that Shakespeare's use of the past is to compel his audiences, elite and otherwise, to learn from, interrogate derivative forms of governance, using classical texts as sites for interrogation while exploring their own politics and identity. Shakespeare's earliest tragedy, which somehow I managed to get into every lecture I give, Titus Andronicus, is a revenge play set in ancient Rome and built upon the Roman tragedian Seneca's bloody model of revenge and cause. Curtis Perry has argued that political implications are central to Shakespeare's sense of the resources of Senecan tragedy, and his thinking about Seneca is productively entangled with his thinking about the exemplarity of Roman political history. It is not a coincidence, as Farah Cox-Jensen notes, the collapse of the Republic and the rise of the Principate is the period of Roman history with which early modern commentators engage most frequently and sustainedly. The Principate was the form of imperial government established by Augustus in 27 BC. It was the form of Roman rule characterized by a single emperor who outwardly maintained the facade of republican institutions while wielding immense and unprecedented power. It marked the move from republic to empire and must have reminded Shakespeare of his own patron, King James I, who styled himself the new Augustus. I've always felt that we should pay more attention to Titus Andronicus than we do, but mainly because, in addition to its use of violence as a way of commenting on the inherent brutality of the formation of nations, the play boldly points out how the past cannot be improved upon without being truthful about its full implications. Setting plays in the classical past allowed Shakespeare to examine in his own time how history compels society to remember that conquest and difference have been formative in the making of Western culture. His dramaturgy outlines in this play not just that the past is relevant, but that it is present still, and that it has uses, as do the classical texts that register that past. Now, many scholars have written more ably than I will be able to do here about how Shakespeare saw the classical past as a site for deep inquiry, not just because of the stories and myths that constructed its idols, but because that past was too often exalted uncritically, or bits of it selectively ignored altogether. Ian Smith has argued how the violence of Titus Andronicus, for example, is often compelled or followed by the citation of a classical text. Shakespeare's most horrifying depiction of violence against women is at the center of this play. Titus's daughter was assaulted by the Goth's sons and her hands and tongue removed to prevent her from ever revealing her attackers. This awfulness derives directly from Ovidian myth. It is no small gesture on Shakespeare's part for Ovid's book to appear on stage at the vital moment when Lavinia tries to tell her story, while Titus attempts to decipher her with the help of his grandson, Lucius, and his brother, Marcus.
How now, Lavinia? Marcus, what means this? Some book there is that she desires to see. Which is it, girl, of these? Open them, boy. But thou art deeper read and better skilled. Come and take choice of all my library, and so beguile thy sorrow till the heavens reveal the damned contriver of this deed. Why lifts she up her arms in sequence thus?
Marcus answers that he thinks she's saying there were two attackers. Titus then asks, what book does she tosseth so? And Lucius answers, grandsire, 'tis Ovid's Metamorphosis, my mother gave it me.
Soft. So busily she turns the leaves. Help her. What would she find? Lavinia, shall I read? This is the tragic tale of Philomel, and treats of Tereus' treason and his rape. And rape, I fear, was the root of thy annoy.
Finally, Titus cries,
patterned by that the poet here describes, by nature made for murderers and for rapes.
Ovid wasn't just relevant. The urgent use of the text captured in Titus's phrase, why does she tosseth so the pages, demonstrates the capacity of the literary to compel us to not just associate the past with the present, but to consider critically what use it has to our lives, our bodies, and our stories. Here, it tells them what happened to her. It is witness. In the second week of my tenure at the Folger, I was invited by the Danish embassy to give a talk about Macbeth, and in their words, its relevance today. Verdi's opera Macbeth was debuting that week in Washington, and the Folger had brought some wonderful manuscripts over. This was not the first time that I struggled with the notion of relevance. I explained that rather, I wanted to show how the play might be mined for clues that shed light on the urgent need in our own moment for critical discernment, deep inquiry, skillful truth extraction, and independent thought. So here, I'm going to renew and sophisticate that argument a little bit that I made to a group of diplomats and agency workers, and share one perspective on Shakespeare's position in 1606 when he wrote Macbeth, which was only 3 short years after King James I had ascended to the throne in England and taken up the role of patron of Shakespeare's company. It's useful to note that prior to this year, the Crown had foiled one of the greatest conspiracies in history, the Gunpowder Plot. A plot to blow up the Houses of Parliament and assassinate the king was masterminded, apparently, by a group of Catholic dissidents. Shakespeare knew his royal patron and understood that the plays he wrote would be viewed by him, judged by him, and would therefore determine not only the success of his theater company, but perhaps even the length of his career or even his life. He knew the importance, therefore, of political subtlety. He understood how essential it was to use his art to agitate the status quo, but to do so through artfulness and sometimes through stealth. He also had some knowledge of the king's grievances and his fears and anxieties, and that had too much influence on his rule. 2 concerns in Macbeth that were useful to note will demonstrate how in one small way we can use Shakespeare to think with as we move him beyond relevance to a place of essential use. Conspiratorial thinking and misinformation were both in Shakespeare's mind, believe it or not, as a playwright that was connected to the state through his theater company. Shakespeare would have had a deep awareness of the political and cultural forces that helped create early modernity, and he was a first-hand witness to the rising culture of surveillance, political ambition, and economic greed. Scholars have wondered for centuries what Shakespeare truly thought of things like love, hate, or witchcraft. If he himself expressed misogynist wanderings in his representation of the Weird Sisters, for example, but I often caution those attempting to determine what Shakespeare actually thought that it's an impossible task, and in some ways, it's hardly the point. The play's concern seems to be what happens when authoritative voices, those that are trusted with power, launch or repeat and reinforce conspiratorial thinking, eventually establishing it as truth. So I want to provide an example from witchcraft lore that does feed the plot structure of Shakespeare's play. A 16th century Puritan lecturer and Cambridge scholar, George Gifford, repeated the belief that a witch is, quote, one that worketh by the devil. Many had argued that becoming a witch is possible only through copulating with the devil. But the myth is reinforced here through an authoritative clerical and academic voice. The Elizabethan barrister and judge Edward Coke, one of the most influential jurists of the Renaissance period, reinforced in his third part of the Institute of the Laws of England that, quote, a witch is a person that hath conference with the devil to take counsel or do some act. Here we have the authoritative opinion of a judge. Finally, in Book 2 of Demonology, a witchcraft treatise published in 1597, and we have such a beautiful handwritten version in our collection, authored by King James VI of Scotland and First of England, it says that, quote, the devil used means to entice witches to his service, and often they can be seen kissing his hinder parts. A ritual known as osculum infame. For James, the female sex is, quote, frailer than man, and therefore of weak faith, more susceptible to being taken in by the devil and diabolism. Here we have the ultimate authoritative voice of a king. Macbeth draws on the processes whereby conspiratorial thinking becomes fact and dramatizes how unspeakable acts are brought about through the power of suggestion and erroneous belief. It unearths the process by which truth can be submerged, particularly in the face of fear. For Shakespeare, fear is one of the most dangerous emotions, not because we sometimes feel it as we should, but because of the way governing authorities can use it to quell inquiry and critical thought. The Shakespearean scholar Alison Hobgood points out in her fabulous book, Passionate Playgoing, that in Macbeth, we find the word fear is used over 40 times, more so than in any other play. Shakespeare's trying to make a point. By staging a play using the prophecies of witches, or as he calls them, weird sisters, Shakespeare is titillating the fantasies built by the literature and proclamations that had been made about such suspicious devil-kissing women. So it's easy to assume that they are the source of evil and wrongdoing in the play. The attractive allure of witchcraft and its special effects is suitably distracting from the real problem in the play, human ambition and its capacity to be masked. As a quick reminder, the play follows Scottish hero Macbeth, the Thane of Glamis, who as 3 witches prophesy will become Thane of Cawdor, and then advance to King of Scotland, while also hearing that his friend Banquo's descendants will inherit the Scottish throne ultimately. No mention of Macbeth's offspring, of which, as we know, there are none. So the promise of ultimate power, much to Macbeth's dismay and worry, is devastatingly impermanent before it even begins. After he sends his wife word of the prophecy, she plots, and when he returns, they conspire to kill the king when he visits their castle Dunsinane. Macbeth murders Duncan, and for a short while experiences paroxysm of regret and guilt.
Methought I heard a voice cry, "Sleep no more. Macbeth doth murder sleep." The innocent sleep. Sleep that knits up the raveled sleeve of care. The death of each day's life, sore labor's bath. Balm of hurt minds. Great nature's second course. Chief nourisher in life's feast.
He understands the cost. He tells only his wife his fears and his full expectation that he will suffer scorpions of the mind. His mind will never really be at rest. We know Macbeth becomes king, but a murderous one, inspiring fear, not respect, terror, not love, fully aware that his reign will come to an end. He has no bloodline, no successor, so the problem becomes, how does he hold on to something that is fated to end? Machiavellian murder is one way. Ordering the murder of Banquo and his son gets away, however, haunts him. Macbeth's fears find expression at a royal banquet when he thinks he sees the bloody-haired ghost of his friend Banquo. Now, thinking about Shakespeare's portrayal of the supernatural for a moment, Shakespeare's representation of ghosts is useful here. It is indeed multifaceted. Hamlet's ghostly father, for example, is real, so to speak, in that Hamlet isn't the only one who witnesses it. But does Macbeth really see the ghost of Banquo, or is it an illusion? The power of fear to ignite the imagination, or vice versa, was a grave concern to the intellectual reformers of Shakespeare's time. For them, the sense of sight was actually the crucial portal for information. But sight can be manipulated. This is what playwrights counted on. Illusion is at the heart of early modern theater making, after all. Shakespeare's theatricality relied on sight, spectacle, and optics as much as it did on sound and hearing the words. But crucially, it required the thinking skills of the audience too, to discern what is fact and what is fiction. Shakespeare draws on the contemporary understanding that sight is unreliable in his staging of the supernatural. Mary Thomas Crane, therefore, asks an important question about this relationship between sight and theatricality when she says, did theater offer the audience a version of the truth or a deceptive illusion? Puritans of the time who wrote rabidly against playhouses, such as William Rankin's, argued that theater was indeed deceptive and that it could, as he says, bleareth men's eyes and lead people with enticing shows to the devil. Built into the machinery of theater, it is true, is the suggestion to its audience as to whether it can trust what it sees or believe what it hears. But theater, paradoxically, through illusion and tricks, offers a portal to the truth. Shakespeare's writing was partly inspired by the 16th century French philosopher Michel de Montaigne, who I also try to get into every lecture I write. He himself reflected on the ease with which people fell for illusions and images, how they might ignore or not see the truth because of the power of their imaginations. He warned that the belief in visions, enchantments, and other such extraordinary effects is rooted in the power of the imagination, being particularly effective, as he says, on softer souls. The belief has been so forcefully imparted on them that they think they see what they do not see. For Montaigne, and I believe Shakespeare, the answer to this was the cognitive muscle of discernment, the capacity to interpret information, to use this faculty that they believed God gave humans to piece together what is real and what is not, to distinguish between competing narratives. In the prologue to Henry V, Shakespeare plays with illusion, but then provides a map for his audience so they can navigate what they see on stage. He invites them to deploy a tactic he uses often in his work, double vision, seeing something for what it is, even while you participate in a belief that it is something else, the very heart of meta-theater, which is theater sort of referring to itself. This required a robust reflex, or robust flex of the imaginative muscle. In his storytelling, Shakespeare presents an image, a fiction, while simultaneously undercutting our experience of the fiction, reminding us that what we imagine is and is not what we are seeing.
Can this cockpit hold the vasty fields of France? Or may we cram within this wooden O the very casks that did affright the air at Agincourt? Oh, pardon, since a crooked figure may attest a little place a million, and let us, ciphers to this great account on your imaginary forces, work. Suppose within the girdle of these walls are now confined two mighty monarchies. Piece out our imperfections with your thoughts. Into 1,000 parts divide one man, and make imaginary puissance. Think, when we talk of horses, that you see them, printing their proud hooves in the receiving earth. For 'tis your thoughts that now must deck our kings.
It seems counterintuitive for a poet, or playwright rather, to create elaborate devices and while showing his audiences how to read beneath them. In addition to helping flex cognitive muscles through his dramaturgy, we can consider the relationship between truth and illusion. Going back to Macbeth now, Shakespeare shows us examples of misinformation and its true meaning that a kernel of truth helps carry the story. When Macbeth meets the witches again, they deliver the meat of their prophecies, giving him a temporary but false sense of security as they artfully tell him the truth. But already in a state of panic about losing power, it activates his confirmation bias, his facility for hearing what he wants to hear. Terrified of losing power, he seeks to discover what he must do to maintain it. In this sequence, Shakespeare purposely embeds the tools for extracting truth from a barrage of manipulated information within a play that draws upon one of the most effective misinformation campaigns in European medieval and Renaissance history. By the 1600s, ideas about witchcraft had been fixed, established by the most authoritative sources in the land. Shakespeare's play shows us the channels we might explore to dig deeper into the mechanics of myth-making. One of the identifying definitions of misinformation is that authentic material is deliberately used in the wrong context, and that the content can be artfully manipulated, deliberately designed to be interpretable in multiple ways. And this concept is ancient. Misinformation is nothing new. It has long been a political tool. By using the witches as a source of authentic but deliberately confounding information, Shakespeare makes the witches a metaphor themselves, a vehicle to explore Macbeth's and, by extension, our own cognitive tendencies for scouring only surface meaning to confirm our sense of self, our inability to see facts that might destabilize a false sense of control and that protect our desire for certainty and security. The thing about this tendency is that it never really cures us of our uncertainties or insecurities. When the witches conjure the prophetic apparitions, one of them tells Macbeth to laugh to scorn the power of man, for none of woman born shall harm Macbeth. Seems cut and dry. No human being could ever kill him. But if you know the play, you'll know Macduff was, quote, untimely ripped from his mother's womb, meaning she died before she could give birth, and he was born via cesarean section. In Shakespeare's day, once you died, you were no longer identifiable by your gender. It takes some deduction before you realize what the riddle means. And indeed, Shakespeare shows us what happens when you don't apply human reasoning at its highest level. Misinformation is designed to obliterate the energy required for high-level deductive reasoning. We hear from another apparition that Macbeth can be lion-mettled as he needs not care who chafes, who frets, or where conspirers are, because he will be safe until great Birnam Wood to high Dunsinane Hill shall come against him. Again, cut and dry. Great Birnam Wood, the forest beyond Dunsinane, can't possibly march or come towards his castle. It would require trees to uproot, gain a spirit, and move. This one is a bit harder. The truth buried in this prophecy is more difficult to access because it is too fantastical, too absurd to consider it ever being a reality. That soldiers of Malcolm and Macduff's army would camouflage themselves with branches from the forest trees and advance slowly on Dunsinane was not within Macbeth's comprehension by the time he hears this prophecy. So Shakespeare shows us the intellectual challenges of what was then referred to as equivocation. Sometimes it will defeat us, which is why we must stay vigilant to its deliberate aims of confoundment. So I'm under no illusions here that Shakespeare can save us. But grappling with his work, and given the dialogue between our social world and his political and social world, we could make use of the materials of his dramatic output in the here and now. Engaging with the work in this active sense aids us to ask what speaks to us directly and how we might make use of it as we attempt to solve problems in our own time. Sure, Shakespeare is relevant, but his work as representative of the humanities as a whole is useful too. We need to pursue this argument collectively. We need to build a national conversation that assumes the logic that the humanities is indispensable because it helps us to create habits of mind that enable us to see when liberty and truth are at stake. In our corner of the humanities, Shakespeare, I want to make clear that I do not think Shakespeare can solve your problems. He's dead. I want to suggest we should keep him around, not because he's relevant, but actually because his work is really useful. The critical and creative work we do with his plays as readers, students, teachers, academics, theater directors, actors, audiences, or librarians is what matters. And organizations like the Folger have a critical role to play in sharing this potential, and maybe, just maybe, and I'm not being idealistic here, or maybe I am, we can save the humanities. And someone chuckled. Chuckle at this, and save ourselves in the process. Thank you.